Hello and welcome to the Onstage Colorado podcast. I'm your host, Alex Miller, and we're here in early February with lots of new shows opening around the state. As always, if you want to see everything that's happening on stage in Colorado, go to onstagecolorado.com, where we've got all the calendar listings plus news, reviews, and more. On today's podcast, I'm honored to have playwright Tony Meneses, whose new play, 2050, opens at the Denver Center this week. I was fortunate to have heard a reading of this play at last year's Colorado New Play Summit, and I was struck at the time by what a powerful piece of work it is. Of course, in these dark Trump years, immigration, racism, ethnic identity, and even white nationalism have all had a prominent place in the national discourse, and Meneses' play really taps into that conversation in an unexpected way by setting the action 30 years in the future, 2050. So I asked Tony how he arrived at this idea, the challenge of putting it all together, and his own journey as a playwright. Along the way, we also talked about the ways in which early groups arriving in the U.S., such as the Irish and Italians, eventually assimilated into the blanket of white, and whether that same outcome is in the cards for Latinos. Indeed, that question is at the very heart of this new play. Here's my conversation with playwright Tony Meneses. All right, we're here at the Denver Center with Tony Meneses, playwright of 2050. So thanks a lot for being on the podcast today, Tony. Appreciate it. I got a chance to see 2050 last year at the Colorado New Play Summit in its reading form. So now it's on February 7th. It's going to be at the Space Theater here at the Denver Center in a full-on production. So I wanted to kind of back up just a little bit to the first kernel of the idea that you had to do this play. So I was wondering, where did the inspiration for the story itself come from?
For me, the play, like the very first thought of it came on a balcony in Brooklyn. I was hanging out with friends, just talking about, and this is before the election, so just talking about the general direction of where things were heading. Identity politics had become such a conversation piece, especially in the artistic community. At that point, I think like the Oscars So White stuff had started to happen. So I think it was somewhere in the ether of that conversation of like, you know, what is representation? What is identity? And then just looking at sort of historical trends, the conversation went in that direction about, you know, how other immigrant communities had been assimilated into sort of the hegemony of what this country is, and sort of this what if came to mind of like what, you know, who's the next community, and what if it happened to Latinos, that Latinos got absorbed into the definition of whiteness sometime into the future, the way that it has happened with other groups in this country.
Right. And I think you mentioned like Italians and Irish.
Yeah, specifically, yeah. I mean, any immigrant community has always been, of course, ostracized and otherized when they arrived. Irish, Italian, Greek, I mean, just you name it. They've all been on the outside at first. And just general trends with assimilation eventually in order to become American, which is interchangeable with white most of the time, those trends shift. And then what that shift reinforces in terms of, you know, just white supremacy and how it works and sort of how that permeates in every part of how society looks at people who are and are not part of the us and them kind of dynamic.
So thinking about the process of the play itself, you had like I mentioned, the reading. How much has the script changed since that a year ago? And
yeah, the summit was just a really great opportunity. It's a good laboratory. We have two readings, one weekend and the next weekend. So it changed from one weekend to the next, believe it or not. And now that we're in rehearsal and we have more time to really look at sort of the granular things of what the play is saying and doing, it's definitely shifted some of the arguments of the play. You know, it's a very heady play at times in terms of like looking at an intellectual exercise of like, imagine if this happened. So just making sure the clarity and the logic of that lands and no one's tripping up on, wait, what does that mean in 30 years? So there's been a lot of cleaning up of that and just looking for more moments for characters. That's kind of the bread and butter for me. I love spending time with any character. So I have these 7 people that I'm kind of in charge of and crafting and making sure that they all have little moments or big moments where we really get insight into who they are and their humanity.
Okay. So, you know, this is a pretty timely play, as we were talking about, despite being set in the future in 2050. So it describes an America where a lot has changed for Hispanics. And as we said, you compared it to the Italian and Irish of maybe a century or more ago. So do you see this as a cautionary tale for today's Hispanic Americans so that they could lose that? Yeah,
I think that's been the kind of the phrase I've been using to describe the play. It does feel like a cautionary tale. also say like it's a social justice dystopia of where we are as a community, specifically the Latino community, and just asking us to sort of self-inflect and look at, like just positing this question to people who identify as Latino and sort of asking them to really think about that and grapple with that, right? Because most of the time, people in the theater, it may not be the most working class people, but people who are perhaps been educated or just have more access at this point to graduate from sort of the initial beginnings of how immigrants get here. So I'd love for them especially to sort of think about like, wow, where did I come from? How far have I come now at me, myself, my family, my community? And then to just look at like, well, where are we going? And to sort of hopefully keep these trends from happening. Just basically with every community that's shifted into whiteness or been absorbed and assimilated into that definition, it's usually at a cost, and at whose cost, and just the way the country works here. And every country has its own issues with racism and colorism specifically. But, whiteness is sort of in a direct relationship with anti-blackness. So who suffers as a result of that is usually the black community in this country, and how immigrant communities have evolved. It's usually by, separating themselves from that group and saying, we're not them, we're now part of you, the majority here. So just looking at that, I really like, someone used this phrase recently of having like an intra-racial conversation that needs to happen sometimes. I think sometimes when it plays about race or identity, it's usually posited one, white versus whatever. Whereas this is trying to have like an internal conversation of like Latinos with the black community or Latinos within the diaspora of what we all are. I mean, culturally, we're all so different from each other depending on where our origins are from. So just asking us to look inward and see, well, who do we want to be and where are we going?
It's interesting that you were talking about colorism. And when you think about like, say, an Irish person looks fairly similar to an English person to most eyes. I mean, I guess Italians, might be a little darker, but not all of them, So, I mean, how does that colorism affect, how that community might integrate or not, or stay separate?
Yeah, no, I mean, our dramaturg, Sarah Rose Leonard, came in with a lot of really great research. I tasked her with a lot of homework about, can you look at every group that's come here and what was used against them? And Irish, to our eyes today, we're like, oh, that's clearly a white person. But, just like physical traits, physiology, Irish people do have a sort of a maybe more distinct look than other European groups. And that was used against them, sort of very like grotesque insults, like they look like potatoes was actually like some of the research that she found. It's just like, that's obviously so prejudiced, so like disgusting kind of language. But like at the time, or that the eyes of that people saw them in that different way. So, it sounds crazy now. It's like, well, that sounds like so long ago. How would anyone distinguish an Irish person from an other white person? But they could at that time because our eyes were trying to look at that community that way. So like now, a Latino person we recognize as a Latino person, but imagine 30 years in the future where we just don't clock that anymore. We just sort of go, that's just another white person, like it's someone else walking by. So it is sort of a lot of fun imagination work that the audience has to do, which hopefully they can go there and sort of just see the space the way that through the lens of what the play is arguing.
Okay. So, when we spoke briefly last year, you mentioned during the rehearsals that it happened at the time that there was some Trump emergency, and I can't remember which one it was, but it had to do with immigration or one of the bans or something like that. And I remember you saying the whole thing made it seem so real, but things haven't really improved since then. So did any of the latest news inform any of the changes to the script, or is it pretty much still the same situation?
Yeah, so more or less, right? We're looking at words that sort of pop in our ears now, dreamers. We know exactly what that means. How is that going to resonate when we hear that word in 30 years in the play? Even just the word immigrant, ethnicity. So it's a lot of these little kind of buzzwords that have been in the play. Some of them have been adding more along the way. Just how that lands in our ears and how we understand and process them is very different. And yeah, depending on what's happening in the real world, during our process here, Julian Castro dropped out of the presidential race. And that was a really big conversation we all had as a group. That was our one Latino candidate and our various, perspectives on if he had viability or not, and why we didn't think he had it. Was it, how that's ingrained also with our perceptions of like, is America ready for a Latino candidate? So, it definitely changes depending on what's happening in the real world. So, the headlines definitely do impact, I think, how the play is going to be received. So I don't know where we'll be in a month. But, like you said, there's not a lot of things seem to be changing for the better. So hopefully not for the worse, though.
Right. So this play, the plot is set in the future in 2050, and we postulated that the wall was built or some form of a wall.
Yeah, that was a rewrite. That was a fun rewrite. When those conversations got very heated, I added that line change before the summit. We did a workshop before then about, they built that wall. And before it was like they closed the border, but then I added, and they built that wall. And we all know exactly what that means. It resonates in very different ways now.
And so the play is about sort of both sides of that wall and some of the people that are on the north side, sort of shedding some of their identity. And the main character is this politician. And so are there any analogs to that you can see today in a politician? Like, not Julian Castro probably, but or would you use him as an example?
Totally, yeah, without naming names, right? Yeah, no, we see it. That's kind of the reason I wrote this play, because the dynamic that this play is trying to caution against is I already see it happening now. Politically, sure, there are certainly politicians, depending on your point of view, on a certain side that are Latino, but whose policies don't really reflect or benefit that community at all. So it's a complicated space. But really anyone that comes, anyone who's second generation, third generation here, I think you can already start to see the remove. I have nephews who don't speak Spanish, and I speak Spanish because I was born in Mexico and I retained that, but they just don't have that. So I'm already seeing it now with younger generations too, that like the shift is happening, and they're so Americanized. I'm Americanized. I will acknowledge that too. But, what can we do even within that to preserve identity and preserve culture, which is important. And I think when it gets lost, I think it just feeds into sort of a very insidious system that happens here in terms of white supremacy. So it's like if we kept our self-identity perhaps a little bit more closer to who we are, maybe we can avoid the trappings of what happens again and again and again when we fully assimilate into this country and what that means to be American, quote unquote.
Right. And you kind of answered the next question I was going to ask you about, how an ethnic group can hang on to their identity while leaving some of it behind in the pursuit of assimilation. And you're saying, they shouldn't, or they should hang on to a certain percentage of it. And like, what are some of the ways that they can do that?
In the research that our drama troupe brought in, something that just I keep thinking about is just even the invention of the word white is so arbitrary. It was invented just to contrast with the black population that was here. So for me, in my what if, like, kumbaya space that I really do try to like remember and feed, it's like, why don't white people just identify as like Irish Americans still, or Italian Americans? Like, why have we coded that language, and why, to what end, to what purpose is that serving? Which obviously we know what the answer is. But even just little differences like that, semantics, right? If white people who identify as white now actually just like claimed who they actually are, of their European ancestry or wherever in the world they might be from, is a subtle difference. And I think it actually really changed the way we perceive each other. Then at that point, those communities are embracing heritage and where they come from, ethnicity. Like, why do they have to forget that part of who they are? If every culture did that. What's been kind of fun about this play when I shared it with various audiences is that, when white people come up to me, they see themselves in this too. They'll talk about, like my Jewish grandma, she saw that she came here, she like literally crossed the ocean here, and she saw her grandchildren not know how to speak the language anymore, forget about their roots. So it is something that I think any community can access when they really look at like, well, who are we? We're not. No one, I think, is going to be like, I'm happily being white. No, I think when we look at the things that matter, culture and heritage, it's really rooted in something different than sort of these race structures that have been imposed on us here.
Right. And it varies depending on where you are in the country. I grew up in the New York area, and people were keenly aware of, their ethnic background, the Irish, the Italians, kiss me, I'm Italian shirts I remember from when I was growing up. And when I moved to Colorado, nobody out here seemed to care. And so that was really interesting. So I think, and I think also, the sort of the disappearance of regional dialects is kind of related to that as well. So do you, speaking of dialect, is there some of that employed? Is that an issue at all in the script?
Yeah. We're dealing with different generations as far as the characters. We have like a grandma character who very much remembers, our year now, right? The years that we're living currently, which in the play, this is the year 2020, which was where we're in, is the year that their family came here. So she remembers all the stuff that's happening right now, and she's trying to keep that history alive. And then we have her son, who's sort of he is the main character, who's this politician who doesn't know if he's going to lean into his identity, his heritage, and claim that if it helps him politically, but also it's true to who he is, or if he's just going to push that aside and sort of just identify as white just to appeal to a broader constituency. And then his daughter, the granddaughter, is this sort of new generation, has no clue about language or where she came from. At this point, she's just enjoying the privileges of just being American and white. So just giving different voices and perspectives to that. So with dialect, the grandma character has retained that, not broken English, but just has an accent, which is important to remember. I would love for anyone to see sort of their own abuela in that character, and sort of what she means and what she sounds like is really important. I think that's definitely a part of the language and texture of the play.
Yeah, and the lead character is just such a classic. Torn. Oh my gosh, he is torn in. How many directions has he torn in? More than two
identity
or three.
crisis. Every scene, he's like, should I do this? Should I do that? And it hopefully leads to a nice, strong moment at the end where he finally stands for something, and it's a really bold, exciting moment. Hopefully, that the audience will get to see him finally be the man that he was always supposed to be.
Well, that would be refreshing in this days of political weenies everywhere. Onstage Colorado is the state's best place to find information about live theater. Our website at onstagecolorado.com has the most comprehensive calendar for live performances, not just in the metro area, but all around Colorado. That means you can find shows from Boulder to Breckenridge, Denver to Durango, and everywhere in between. Also, the Onstage Colorado review crew gets out to see many of the shows going on around the state. So if you'd like to know more about a show before you buy tickets, chances are we've got a review of it online you can read first. To keep on top of it all, subscribe to our weekly newsletter on the site. It comes out every Thursday and has the latest reviews, podcasts, and also a lineup of new shows opening around Colorado. Find it all on onstagecolorado.com. Be sure to subscribe to the Onstage Colorado podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other podcast platforms. So I want to ask a little bit about you and what inspired you to start writing plays rather than working in another medium, like, I don't know, writing novels or things like that. What first got you writing for theater?
For me, it was kind of the classic journey of any high school theater kid. I always knew that I wanted to be a creative writer. And for a while I thought screenwriting, just because I grew up on movies and television. So I thought that would be the fit. And then when I started doing theater in high school, I was like, this is fun. And it was also just very imaginative. And I love, I'm the youngest of four, and I grew up with a pretty decent gap between my next sibling. She was 7 years older. So I felt like I grew up like an only child. So my playtime was sacred. I just remember that was the most fun I ever had at that time, just getting to be with my toys and making up worlds and keeping journals of all my ideas. I was doing that even at 5.
Oh, wow.
So, it felt like this is something that was always going to be part of who I was. And then when theater came around, I was like, oh, this feels like I can do anything in theater, and playing with that space and the imagination and the suspension of disbelief. So I guess I was very lucky to go to college at 18, wanting to be a playwright, and then leaving, wanting to be a playwright. I was very driven in my purpose of that thing. And I went to grad school right after that. So it's just been very satisfying to sort of, in terms of the broader conversations of representation, every medium has that struggle of whose voice are we acknowledging, whose voice is out there, whether it's novel, film, whatever. And in theater, it is still a deficit. There's not a lot of Latinx artists. So it does feel kind of cool to represent that, to carry that banner very proudly of that's who I am. Those are the people that I write about, and I'm non-negotiable about it. That's just what I'm going to always write about. So having a production here is just it's very validating and very affirming that the hard work that you put into that is finally being given a platform where these people can be seen and heard.
Okay, that's great. So when you're writing, thinking just a little bit about the craft itself, is there a particular type of, you've been doing it for long enough that maybe you've gotten over some of these bumps, but what are some of the things that cause you grief when you're working on your process, when you're working on a script?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, like at this point, I know my point of view and I know my sensibility as well. So it's not just like writing Latina characters, Latinx characters. It's also just like how we're looking at them and sort of the subversive agency and politics of that. So, what I do tend to avoid is sort of stereotypical representations, trying to give a different lens on that. So that's the constant struggle for every play is like, how am I showing Latino people differently? What is it, a coming of age story? Is it a love story? Is it a family drama? Like what can I do to further the cause of how we're, and uplift how we're seen, and still, give a good piece of theater and drama and story, but just to even just show those bodies in different ways, in subversive, surprising ways that doesn't just feed into narratives that I think are often imposed on us, that are not actually who we are most of the time.
So you're talking more about sort of the deeper themes, not so much the structures. Do you feel like that part is you kind of got that down pretty well?
I think so, yeah. I'm definitely, I'm an anxious creature like any other writer. So I think to fight that, I always outline every play that I work on. And I'm not like strict about it, but at least I know a shape and I think structure. Like I've been lucky enough to be in part of a lot of writing groups in New York, and I just finished the Juilliard program like in May. So the most fun I have when I hear my peers and their writing is hearing their structures, like how they literally just like walk us through their worlds, regardless of content or style or voice. I just love seeing how people just create a world and how they guide us through it. So that's the most exciting part for me. I love structure. I love it so much, and how I can invert and surprise and subvert. That just feels like the job. If I think of any new writer, stories, we've all heard the kinds of stories over and over again. So it's like our responsibility is to innovate and do it in a new, surprising way that's true to who we are and our voice, and hopefully just kind of dazzle everyone with something that we know. We know what a love story is. We know what a coming of age story is, but how we do it, how we execute it, this is how we structure it. That's always an exciting challenge for me to think about.
So how many plays have you had produced so far?
This is professional productions. This is probably my third professional production, and I have a fourth one coming up right after this one. So I was
just going to ask about like the kind of that feeling of seeing it go from the page to a reading, and a reading to a full production. What does that feel like?
I mean, it's fun at every stage, and it's lucky enough that I think so much within our playwriting community, we sort of sometimes get trapped in what's called like a development hell, which means we just get reading after reading after reading. We never get to see it become a production. So
right.
I've been lucky enough that I've gotten to see my stuff on its feet. So with these productions, at least the plays that I feel really serious about getting out there, thankfully they've found homes and places to be developed and seen that. So I would say the biggest difference is, just now that we're 3-4 weeks into our process, it's really now about my director's artistry and the staging that he is doing and finding with the actors. It's just beautiful. It's like choreography. You're just watching like this dance. And I mean, just now 10 minutes ago, he just retooled something, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, it's like a puzzle piece. You're like, click, that's exactly where it needs to be. And the actors were like, that felt so good. And it's fun to see the kind of kinesthetics of your words actually alive and embodied and moved through with the words that you have created for them as sort of the crumbs to get them there, but then they really kind of lift it with their own work.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, it's got to be just amazing to see all those puzzle pieces coming together. And I wanted to ask, well, you mentioned that you're working on something new, so something coming up pretty quickly. It sounds like what's next? Right
after this, I dive into rehearsals for this play called The Hombres, which is an all-male show, which I wrote as a challenge to myself because I usually. My joke is like my nightmare is being in a room full of men, and I'm going to force myself to do it. It's a lot about machismo and toxic masculinity within our Latino perspective. So last week I went back to New York to cast that show. So we have a cast. We're ready to go. One of our actors actually in 2050 is also going to be in that production. So we get to travel together on that one. So that's coming up, and that opens in April at True River Theater in New Jersey. And then I have a reading of another play called El Borracho that's coming up as well. So that's going to be in late April. So I sort of feel like I have like these three plays, 2050 and El Borracho and The Hombres, that I don't know, I feel like a Jane Austen novel. I have 3 daughters that I'm trying to marry off to the right suitors and making sure that's a good pair for them. So I am very actively trying to think about where all these 3 plays are going to go and their lives into the future.
Oh, well, that's exciting to have that much going on. You talked a little bit about, the importance of, the voice of Latinx and I was wondering, how do you find some of those new playwrights coming up and help them along? Do you have your eyes on anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I have a good fortune of just, like I said, being part of these writing groups in New York. So when you graduate from these programs, they ask you to become like a reader and evaluator. So they throw a pile of plays at you and you sort of are reading, and I get really excited whenever it's any person of color, and like it's just my responsibility to like lift and advocate, especially with those voices. So yeah, especially when I see like a Latino writer, I'm just like, oh, okay, let me see what this is going to be. And it's really fun to see like kind of like the new wave of writers who are doing and reinventing the wheel in their own way and what they're giving voice to, the characters that they're giving voice to. So yeah, I love championing new voices and helping them. And some of these writing groups have taken my voice seriously. They've let these writers in. So it's like nice that they are taking it as seriously as I do. And there's a lot of good work out there that's happening that just needs that platform to be shown.
All right. Good to know. Well,
Tony Meneses,
playwright of 2050, opening here at the Denver Center February 7th. Best of luck with everything. Break legs all around. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us on the On Stage Colorado podcast.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right, great stuff. Thanks a lot to Tony Meneses for being on the On Stage Colorado podcast. His play 2050 is directed by Henry Godinez, the director of the Latino Theater Festival and resident artistic associate at the Goodman Theater in Chicago. He's also a professor at Northwestern University. 2050 opens February 7th at the Denver Center's In the Round Theater, The Space. If you're looking for shows, showtimes, reviews, and more, be sure to check out OnStageColorado.com, Colorado's premier live theater website. Please, if you know of somebody who you think would be interested in this conversation or the podcast in general, please let them know about it and subscribe where you can. Thanks for listening to the On Stage Colorado podcast, and we'll see you at the theater.